Well, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar and interim rector here, and whether you're joining us in person on Park Avenue or online at stbarts.org, it is a joy and delight to welcome you to the forum where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. This morning, we're having a conversation about what restoration means after someone is convicted of a crime. And we're very honored to have with us Jeffrey Grant. He is an attorney and advocate. He runs something called the White Collar Support Group, which I think he'll talk about in a minute. He used to be my neighbor when I was in ministry in Norwalk, Connecticut. You were involved in a ministry in Bridgeport. He is also friends with our own Elizabeth Kelly, recent forum speaker herself. So Jeff, it's really great to welcome you to St. Bart's, and thanks so much for being here.
Peter, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming here. I just like to start with a prayer, if that's okay. Just join me, please, in prayer for a moment. God, Heavenly Father, thank you for watching over us and watching over all of your children who are in pain and distress all over the world, and especially within a block radius of this church. As you know, there was a shooting here this week, and we learned something about the church's response to it at the 9 o'clock service. So, of course, our prayers and blessings go out to the family and all affected. In your son's name, amen. Thank you, everybody. I have to tell you, after attending the 9 a.m. service, I'm a little bit numb. I did not realize that this was going to be the first service after the shooting here just half a block away. And and I want to thank especially someone in the room, Tony, who's here in the second row. Tony came up to me before the service and shared a little bit of his story with me, actually on the steps of the church. And that was a blessing for me, so I want to thank you for that. So I'm going to start by just telling you what the takeaways are going to be in advance. And in a way, the takeaway is, just don't sit there, do something. It's hard, I'm here to talk about white-collar crime, families that have been affected by white-collar crime, families that have been prosecuted for white-collar crimes, and, typically that's a difficult subject, not one that's met with a lot of empathy and compassion in the world. But it's getting better, and that's led to all kinds of opportunities to be able to be of service and advocacy in the world. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to give you a little bit of my backstory, and then I'm going to talk about two projects that we're involved in. The first is the Federal Expungement Initiative, which some of you might know about already. If not, I'll tell you more about it. And the second is a conference that we have coming up online on October 11th, which will actually be our second conference. Our inaugural was last year, and that's for specifically by and for families that have been affected by and prosecuted for white-collar crimes, but also professionals and other people who are interested. Last year we had probably 150 attendees, and I would imagine this year we're going to have about 300 attendees or so. So I'll tell you more about that. So there's my thesis statement. I've given you the format. So let me give you a little bit about my background. I am an attorney. I'm a white-collar attorney, and I was originally licensed to practice law in 1981. So I'd love to tell you that I'm an attorney who's been practicing for over 40 years, but that's not true, because I had a break of almost 20 years in between, where I was disbarred and then served 13 months in federal prison for a white-collar crime I committed in 2002. In the years leading up to my disbarment in 2002, I had a sports injury, and I became addicted to prescription opioids. And I did not know at the time that I was kind of in that early cohort of people who prescription opioids were being pushed on. Everybody's, I'm sure, read about Purdue Pharma and all these things that were going on, and certainly I was not immune to that. And after my surgery in 1992, I became heavily addicted. And for the next 10 years, I took some form of prescription opioids almost every day. And for the life of me, I don't know how doctors were allowed to do that. I don't blame anyone but myself. And I don't think that could happen today in quite the same way. But slowly, my life deteriorated to the point where I could barely function. And by the end of the 90s, I was barely showing up at work. I was physically different, emotionally different. I was a shell of the person I was and the person I was to become. So I made some poor ethical choices and some other choices that turned out to be criminal. And in July of 2002, I found out that I was indeed going to lose my law license. And that day, I filled my last prescription of prescription opioids and went home that night. And after my ex-wife and children went to bed, I took the entire vial and tried to kill myself. Luckily, I did not, obviously, but I woke up in a pool of vomit. And I would imagine I expectorated most of what I took. But following that was rehab, and then kind of the destruction of my old life. Lost all of my friends, my reputation, most of my money, soon to lose our home. Our family was to break up, and I had to start a new life. And I did that mostly in Alcoholics Anonymous and through a dedication to faith communities. At the time, after my wife kicked me out, I did meet a new woman, Lynn Springer, who then was my girlfriend, is now my wife, by the way. And we were attending Jewish services on Friday night and church on Sunday mornings, and 3 AA meetings a day for the first 2 years. So I can tell you that for the most part, my life was either in a church or in a church basement, or just trying to do anything I could to try to put the oxygen mask on myself first so that I could help save my family and my children, and then be of maximum service to those around me. But it was a serpentine path. It's not something that just happens overnight. You know, I didn't wake up the morning after I tried to kill myself, you know, as a now former New York City lawyer, and the next morning I said, I have a good idea. I'm going to become a progressive Catholic priest. That took a few years to figure out. But I did turn myself over to God, and to, in AA, that's probably a higher power, and went through the path of some kind of redemption story, although I didn't know it at the time. About 2 years after I returned home from prison, because I was arrested, and then I did have to go to prison from 2006 to 2007. And after I returned home from prison, I worked in rehabs, and I went to the young associate pastor at the Second Congregational Church in Greenwich, where I was attending. And I asked him, what do you think I should do with my life? You know, I have all of this experience and all this trajectory that I'd like to do something with. And he suggested that I go to seminary. And I didn't know what a seminary was. And I'm a Jew, so I really didn't know what a seminary was. And I thought a seminary was, a place where, monks walked around wearing hoods and things. I really didn't know. But he explained to me what a progressive seminary was, and he pointed out a few to me, like Yale and Harvard and Union Theological Seminary up at Columbia. And I did apply to Union, and they took me, which was amazing because, again, at that point, I had been to prison for white-collar crime. And I just want to point out, I met two of my very, very best friends there and colleagues, Father Joe Saccone and Father Rick Thorsel, who's here. And they're with my church. And by the way, Joe was just this week made the presiding bishop of the church, so I just want to congratulate him for that. So I'm especially honored, for him being here, besides We've been buddies for 15 years now, and he knows what would happen to him if he didn't show up. So I became a reverend, and I started working in the churches. And the first church I worked in was in the inner city in Bridgeport, and it was dirt poor. And something I didn't know about, having come from an affluent suburb and living in Greenwich. And I had been working in AA with people in Greenwich, in AA, captains of industry who were brought to their knees and were probably going to be going to prison. And then I would get on the Metro North instead of South. So on the train platform, there were like 300 businessmen or businesswomen going down to Manhattan. And then there was like 6 of us on the train platform going north up to Bridgeport. And I started blogging about it, like, this is crazy. Like, it's like nobody really notices the 6 people on the other side. And it was me and some landscapers and some housekeepers. And I started blogging about it. And at some point, a reporter from a hedge fund magazine reached out to me and said, are you the minister to hedge funders? And I said, well, I work with hedge funders in AA in Greenwich, and I am a minister in Bridgeport, but those concepts have never actually come together. And he said, well, I'd like to interview for you for this magazine. And I ran into the kitchen. I went to my wife, Lynn. I said, I think our big idea has come. I think we can start a ministry to support people who've been prosecuted for white-collar crimes and their families. And she just looked at me like another crazy idea I had. But we went to see the senior rector at Christ Church in Greenwich. It was the big Episcopal church. And we know that church very well, and we knew the rector. And he said, I think it sounds like a great idea, but you have to prove to me that there are people who would actually attend that ministry, who would be involved. And I said to him, look, behind a lot of the closed doors and windows, even in places like Greenwich, there are people with secret lives who are suffering. And he looked at me and he said to me, well, you got to prove it. So we took it on the road. And we guest preached all over, up and down the East Coast, and we preached at conferences. And after about 6 months, they accepted us as an outreach ministry in their church. And we set off. And the way we started was by starting a white-collar support group online. And it was the fledgling technology at the time, which was, I think, GoToMeeting. And we didn't know how we were going to get the word out because, there are people prosecuted for white-collar crimes all over the country, all over the world. And we had 4 people at our first meeting. And but we grew steadily, and the word got out. And then by 2021, a few things happened. One, I was reinstated to the New York bar, so I am a lawyer again. I want to tell you that. 2, there was an article that came out about our ministry and the White Collar Support Group in the New Yorker magazine. So I think it's safe to say that the history of our support group and of our mission can pretty well be divided before the New Yorker and after the New Yorker. Because certainly, rising to the attention of a full-length article in the New Yorker was an amazing turn. But also it was the pandemic, and there had been a lot of adoption to the kind of technology that was going on, and people were accepting of all kinds of help and all kinds of community online. So we set off to the point now where we have 1,500 people who have attended our white-collar meetings on Monday nights. This coming Monday night is our 477th meeting on Monday night. We've been doing it for 9.5 years. We have other events. We have a Tuesday night speaker series, which is open to everybody. I certainly invite you. And we have our conference, which I mentioned a little while ago. So now I'm going to kind of tell you the story about the federal expungement initiative and how that happened. Because for most of this time, for years, we stayed in our lane. I mean, we were a support group. It was kind of fashioned around AA, in the AA model. And that was our lane. You know, we were being of service to people, and we were providing services, and we were not trying to get too far astray. Also, people prosecuted for white or indicted or incarcerated for white-collar crimes really didn't have a seat at the criminal justice table. You know, it just, either we were not big enough, or we were looked at kind of as an orphan in terms of criminal justice. But some things changed in the last 6 months. Mostly, the previous administration and the current administration in Washington started giving out a lot of pardons. I'm sure you've read about it. And the concept of pardons shifted. This is not politics. This is not better or worse for the party. It's just all of a sudden there's a lot of pardons. And it went from very, very few pardons a year to thousands of pardons. And we took a step back and we said, you know, pardons are very good for our community, but we would have to figure this out in just the right way, because we certainly didn't want to look like people who had trying to take advantage of a situation or had sour grapes, or we're a ministry that's been around now for over a decade, and we believe in spiritual solutions to material problems. But all of a sudden, this window has opened up, and we got to figure out what to do. So I was listening to a webinar. I wasn't on the panel of the webinar. I was just an attendee, and it was being moderated by Doug Berman, who's a law professor at Ohio State University Law School. Also, he writes a blog, the Sentencing Law and Policy blog, that a lot of criminal defense lawyers read. And he was moderating it, and one of the panelists was a professor named Rachel Barkow, who had served time, there we go, had served on the U.S. Sentencing Commission. And they were talking about pardons, and this one sentence came out of her mouth that said, you know, there's nothing stopping Congress from passing a federal expungement law. But it had never been tried. It had never been advanced. And I thought I heard her right, but, you know, like, it wasn't really completely on topic. So afterwards, I gave her a call, and I introduced myself. And we knew each other from some common people anyway. And I said, you know, I think I heard what you said. Is that true? And she said, yeah. In fact, she had been a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Scalia. And she said, yeah, there have been a few attempts to pass a federal expungement law, but they've never gotten out of committee. The most recent one was in 2017. And, but, you know, maybe the time is ripe. And I said, I think as a movement and as a support group, we might want to take this on. And I think that it's the right time for people prosecuted for white-collar crimes to have a seat at the criminal justice reform table. And she said to me, well, if you want to pull it together, she goes, I'm all in favor and I'll get involved. But there's a few other people that you certainly have to speak to. So I spoke to Doug Berman from Ohio State, and then I spoke to Mark Osler, who's a professor at University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, who's one of the leading experts on sentencing and non-clemency. And the four of us decided that we were going to launch this federal expungement initiative, which was probably before the last 6 months a crazy thought. But lo and behold, we went around and started to form a coalition of lawyers and policymakers and people with lived experience, and it's just taken off. Already we're getting inquiries from the press and from scholars and from lawyers who want to sign on to be advocates and other advisors, and certainly people who have spoken on our Tuesday night speaker series, like Elizabeth Kelly, who's here and who has spoken here at the forum before. And what a difference! It's my calling. It's God's work. It's faith in action. You know, justice with legs, I think, is as Serene. What's Serene's last name? Karine Jones, I'm sorry, who just is was the president of Union Seminary and has just stepped down or is in the process of stepping down. So we launched it. And little by little, we're going to be writing bills, and we're going to be trying to enroll senators and Congress people as sponsors, and look for that. And some of the people who we've had to get involved are legal teams, because there's a lot of law involved and a lot of history involved. And through the good graces of last year's lead sponsor of our conference, our good friends at the law firm of Paul Weiss, they donated a lot of pro bono time to us, and they've written up a paper for us, a research paper, and we're off and running. So the concept of expungement is a little strange. You may have heard about clean slate in the state systems. And certainly there's a lot of clean slate laws throughout the country. And clean slate could mean expungement in some states. Expungement means that your records are completely removed from the database. Or it could mean record sealing, where the public would have limited access or no access to those records, even if the government or law enforcement would have access to those records. But there was no vehicle for that in the federal system. So basically what it meant for anyone who was prosecuted for any crime in the federal system, white collar, drug crimes, any other crime, that it meant that every sentence is a life sentence. And that's horrifying, because certainly, an analogous situation is, say, when you go into a hospital, and when you walk into the emergency room of a hospital, perhaps the first person you meet is a social worker there who is working on your discharge plan. And you could meet a social worker working on your discharge plan even before you see a doctor. And you want to scratch your head and say, like, discharge plan? I haven't even seen a doctor yet. But they know that their goal is for you to leave the hospital in better shape than when you walked into the hospital. I mean, that's the goal. But in the criminal justice system, in the legal system, not so, in the federal justice system, because there is no case management system where you ever get the opportunity to leave the system. So you're in the system forever. So no matter what the sentence is, whether the sentence is custodial, meaning you go to prison, or non-custodial, which means you go to probation, or you go to halfway house after, you go to home confinement after, you're on federal probation after, you're a felon for the rest of your life. And that follows you around in a lot of different ways. I mean, not only does it affect income and housing and ability to be a full-fledged citizen in a lot of ways, but in all kinds of little ways that you wouldn't imagine. Like, I just heard a story this week of someone who had been home from prison, federal prison, for 30 years and couldn't get a job as a lifeguard. And this is a person who got their law license back. So they're a practicing lawyer, but because they have a federal felony, they can't be a lifeguard, can't be a coach in your child's Little League. A lot of things you can't do because you have a federal felony, even if it has nothing to do with the felony itself. And it doesn't seem right. So as we have talked to people, a lot of other people don't think it's right either. And so this is a movement. It's a movement that we've kicked off a few months ago, and you can find out more about it on the website that we started, federalexpungement.org. And there's information there, and there's certainly photos and bios of all the people who are signing on to be advocates for us. And we feel blessed to be able to bring this basic concept that has been in a lot of states and bring it into the federal movement and into a federal movement, where hopefully we will get some senators to first sign on. And it's bipartisan, so we're looking for Democrats and Republicans or independents, whoever it happens to be. But we're going to do it. I mean, there's no question. And I don't know how long it's going to take, and I don't know if it's going to be of any value to me personally. I'm an OG at this point, and I don't know if it's going to take so long that I'm going to be able to get my record expunged. But I don't think that's the point. I think the point is to just get out there and put one foot in front of the other and do God's will. And hopefully we'll be able to make changes that even 10, 20 years from now, when there's a true culture change, an enlightened culture change, I and the people who are starting this movement will be long forgotten. And that's okay. I mean, this is not about ego. It's not about any of our names being enshrined anywhere. This is about doing the right thing, which leads to the conference that we have coming up. What a blessing. I mean, last year, we launched this conference online, and it was the first ever by and for people who've been prosecuted for white-collar crimes and their families. And I have to tell you that 6 months before, when we were planning it, we were scared to death. We had no idea if there would be any form of compassion or empathy. We didn't know if people were going to show up. We didn't know if 4 people were going to show up. We didn't know if 40 people were going to show up. But we had a committee, and I want to thank this committee so much. You know who you are. We worked our tails off to try to put together something that was respectful, because we thought that if we respected ourselves, then we would have the ability to insist that other people respect us. And because those of us who have been in the white-collar support group or in our situation, self-respect is a difficult thing. We've been through trauma, stigmatized, and we've learned that in many ways we're our own worst enemies. What's going on in our heads is oftentimes worse than what we're actually facing on the outside. But we did it. And we had this conference, and it was a pivotal moment, a seminal moment in the movement for recognition and for empathy and compassion for people prosecuted for white-collar crimes. And we knew we had to do it again. But like everything that happens, whether it be in a secular setting or in a church setting, it's got to be bigger, it's got to be better, it's got to be, and we resisted that. We resisted that. We said, the job is to spread the word. The job is not to create bigger, better. But we did know that we had a track record now. We had a track record of 10 years of good work and good ministry and white-collar support group meetings. And we had a conference under our belt. And we also had some sponsors that were well-known under our belt. And so we set out to get some speakers and to do some panels that we thought would help spread the word wider and beyond our little criminal justice circle. And we asked Jeffrey Toobin, who's a CNN analyst and who wrote a recent book, The Pardon, and also has had some second chance issues of his own. And we asked him if he would be our keynote, and he said yes. So you see Jeffrey Toobin on CNN. I want you to think of us. I have no idea if Jeffrey Toobin is going to announce this on CNN, but it is good to be in the CNN family a little bit, just because we need to get the word out there. And then we were introduced to Joe Bankman, and Joe Bankman is the Stanford law professor and the father of Sam Bankman-Fried, who you might know, who had a prosecution, a crypto prosecution. He's now serving time in prison. And it was such a big story. And when I spoke to Joe, and then his son Gabe Bankman-Fried, I said, Joe, it seems to me like you have a story to tell that people need to hear about how this affects families, especially in such a high-profile prosecution. Did you ever come back from that? And his answer, just like the rest of us, is no, we're forever changed. But that doesn't mean that we don't move on and we can't do important things to try to help in different ways than we ever knew about before. So Joe is going to be interviewed at our conference by our dear friend Brent Cassidy and one of our support group members. And he has a podcast, so he'll be interviewing Joe Bankman, and we're going to learn more about this from the family point of view. And then we have a panel consisting of some of the professors that I just talked about, and the panel is going to be about pardons and expungement. And so, to marry all of those concepts together and to be able to present it to the world, in this way where not only are we taking the lead, but we're putting our money where our mouths are. We're standing up for this, and this is going to be our cause. And then we have a last panel that are going to be people with lived experience, people from our support group, because certainly of the hundreds of people who we expect to be attending this conference, most of them will not know our stories. Certainly a lot of people, within our community, we know each other's stories, and in fact, a bunch of us are here today, and some of us have never met each other before in person. I mean, we were little boxes on a Zoom call, and we've known each other for years, but we get to meet and we get to hug each other in person. And they all say the same thing to me, by the way. Everyone says to me, "I didn't know you were that tall." And in a little box in Zoom, you don't really get it. And of course, I respond, "I didn't know you were that short." But what a blessing, to just, be able to hug and know that we've been through all of this together, both in being bound by our brokenness, and our common suffering, but also in a way that we've built this life and community together. We've come out of isolation into community all together in the only way that we could. And for many of us who can't leave our homes or our home states, or the only way that we can be together is thanks to this technology. So we're to be in the company of all you good people and some of you support group members. What a gift, and to be provided the opportunity to talk about this by my friend Peter Thompson and his church is just incredible. And we're also going to have a few videos, which are going to be, in a way, the videos are the best part. Everything I talked about is super important, but there's nothing like a well-crafted video that you can not only see for the first time and it takes your breath away, but they live on forever. The whole conference is recorded, and you'll be able to see it on YouTube and on our website and all. By the way, our website is prisonist.org. That's prisonist like feminist.org for more information. But these videos are they're breathtaking. Like I just watched the documentary on Live Aid, and all these rock stars came together back in 1985, and they weren't raising any money. It was a tremendous undertaking in London and in Philadelphia, but then they showed the video of the people starving in Ethiopia, and it was so moving for everybody that you couldn't hear a pin drop. And of course, the documentary is about not just the event, but also kind of like the underpinnings, the structure of the event, and everyone opened up their hearts and their wallets, and that's kind of what we have too for people who outwardly you might not look at and say, that's someone who needs help. I know I don't look like a white collar criminal, but would you even know what one of us looks like? Would you know what a drug addict looks like? Would you know what an alcoholic looks like? Well, that's me. But I've been granted the grace and the opportunity by God to do the work so that I could be sitting up here and share with you. So the last thing I want to do is just go back to the takeaway, and the takeaway is don't just sit there, do something. We need your help, because we can't do this alone. I can tell you that you can go to, if you're within our community, in the criminal justice community, you can go to a conference every day of the week, every weekend of the week. But it's pretty much the same people talking to each other over and over. And it's also true, by the way, of the ABA and the certified fraud examiners and everyone else who gives us the opportunity to speak. We're pretty much speaking to each other in some way. But to take this out and really go into faith communities and go into the world at large and say, we need your help because we are all children of God. And as you treat the least of us, right, is as you treat yourself. We're just a mirror of you. And so we need you. So please attend the conference. Again, that's at whitecollarconference.com. You'll get all of it. That's an easy one to remember, by the way. whitecollarconference.com, not a hard one to remember. And it's October 11th in the morning from 9 a.m. to noon Eastern online. I hope you'll attend. I hope you'll learn more about us. And I hope you'll open your hearts and minds to people who are out there suffering, but are afraid to come out of their homes or to peek through the blinds and are afraid of the stigma and shame that they feel. But with our warm embrace, that we can welcome them back into our community. So thank you so much for the time this morning. I appreciate so much, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jeff. We have a few minutes for your questions. If you're here in person in the room, there are question cards. If you raise your hand, Suzanne Vorster will come around with them. Fill that out, and she'll bring them up to me. If you're joining us online, you can type your questions into the live chat on YouTube, the comments on Facebook, or email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. Email also works if you're here in the room. Jeff, you made a few references to the larger criminal justice field. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between white-collar criminals and other criminals, and the importance of looking at criminal records for criminals of all kinds.
Thank you, Peter. By the way, if we have 2 hours, this is my favorite topic. So we'll be running right through the 11 o'clock. Fundamentally, there's no difference between people who are prosecuted for white-collar crimes and anyone else. If you look at the mitigating factors or the things that have happened to people in their lives, it always comes down to, basically two things, environmental issues or pathological issues. And it's very easy to see, in inner-city crimes, people who have been prosecuted for inner-city crimes, because the social determinants of health are kind of there, poor, educational issues, single-parent families, things like that, access to health care, things like that, school-to-prison pipeline. But in many people who've been prosecuted for white-collar crimes, not so easy to see. But they're there if we look, and you'll find a lot of heartbreak, early childhood trauma, drug and alcohol, addiction, other forms of compulsive behavior, all kinds of environmental factors that you wouldn't otherwise notice unless you looked really hard. And so for the time I spent doing criminal justice work in the inner city and in being a pastor in an inner city church, I was able to really bring that into the white collar movement and kind of use both to help one another. I think that, did I answer the question? Mm-hmm. All right, so I think I answered the question.
And what does expungement look like? How is that different for white-collar criminals and other criminals, if it is at all?
I don't know that expungement is different, but I do know that there will be some rules to the game as to how to get your record expunged. And fundamentally, what we're talking about is a culture of pardons or a culture of expungement, because you can't get your record expunged alone. I mean, if, for example, you need 8 years post-conviction in order to apply for an expungement, that's true for everybody. But if you need to have a job in order to get your record expunged, then someone has to give you a job. If you need to, say, attend a faith community, I'm not saying that's the right measure, but if you need to attend a faith community, then a faith community has to embrace you. If you need, you can't do it alone. So ultimately what the goal is for the entire community to be lifted up. You know, the rising tide lifts all boats, and some people will get their record expunged and some people won't. But even for the people who don't get their record expunged, hopefully what it means is as a community, as a greater community, we're all more focused on the things we need to do to help the entire community be more productive and loving and faithful. And that's a good thing.
So lots of interesting questions. Some of the questions revolve around questions of justice and accountability. Folks wondering, how can we ensure that folks who have been committed of crimes remain accountable if their records are just wiped clean?
These are like the best questions. Well, first of all, an expungement is a much longer term project than, say, a pardon. Okay, that's not to say there's not some overlapping issues. But what you see in the paper now as to pardons, they're generally happening quickly, even if someone has put in a pardon application quite a while ago. But an expungement is something that we're anticipating. The only way it'll pass through Congress is that there's going to be a long time period before you'll be able to apply for an expungement. So it's a process where people will only be able to be granted an expungement if they've passed through certain criteria. And that's not to say that some people couldn't recidivate or some people couldn't get through, but for the most part, it's turning time into our ally instead of our enemy.
Can you talk a little bit more about what the process would look like?
Well, that's a good question because there's a lot of politics involved. But as we look at it right now, we assume that this is going to be part of the judiciary and not part of the executive branch, as pardons are part of the executive branch. And that's not written in stone. We'll have to see how that turns out. But as a bipartisan push to be able to look at people through the eyes of what they've done, to have some kind of redemption story is fundamental to the project.
Can you talk a little bit more about the difference between pardon and expungement?
Yeah.
And expungement. Pardon and expungement.
Well, the short answer is that in many of the states, there isn't a difference between pardon and expungement. A lot of terms are used interchangeably. Like, for example, in Connecticut, where I spent most of my adult life, there's a pardons board, and if you can work your way through to actually get a hearing at the pardons board, and then you're granted a pardon, in Connecticut, a pardon is an expungement. Your record is actually expunged. That is true in some states. So there are other states where a pardon is not an expungement. A pardon could be meaning your records are sealed. In the federal system, a pardon, like the pardons you see that the current administration is giving out or the previous administration giving out, a pardon is a forgiveness. So you are forgiven, perhaps your crime, you're forgiven, perhaps your restitution, perhaps your forfeiture, but you still have a criminal record. So you have to check the box. And of course, there's another issue. I might as well just come out. Also, in the age of Google and AI, even if you have a pardon or you have an expungement, there's still kind of the world record out there that still has to be navigated. And we have to figure out how to handle that to truly give people their lives back.
Yeah, there was a question about that kind of reputation, rehabilitation, and what that might look like. Mm-hmm.
Well, we do have, in our white-collar support group, we do have a reputation management focus. In fact, one of the other initiatives that we're launching is a right to banking initiative. And for those of you who don't know, debanking is basically when you're not entitled to use of the financial system or the banking system. And that could be for a lot of different reasons, but for our project, it's because of having a criminal record. And people will come home from prison and their banks will just have sent them a note saying, you're no longer welcome here, and remove your money within 30 days, and you're left on your own. And there are some solutions through it. I'm not saying it's, there aren't workarounds, but you could be doing business with a bank for 30 years, and then they don't tell you the reason why, they just close your account. And so that's kind of a form, one of the byproducts of reputation management. So we're working our way through that. Stay tuned. We will have a lot more on reputation management and debanking probably for next year's conference.
Finally, we have to stop in a minute or two. You went to seminary, you're ordained. What is the theology for you behind this? You mentioned the least of these, Matthew 25, and one of the least of these is those we visit in prison. Tell me how your faith guides and informs this work.
When Peter and I first talked about this, we were talking about what I wanted to present, and I've guest preached all over, and sometimes I'll preach from the lectionary, or I'll give a talk from the lectionary. And I was sitting at the 9 o'clock service this morning, and it was the parable of the rich man from Luke. And I'm going, oh, I wish I was talking about that. I wish I was talking about that this morning. And I guess in some ways I am. I'm a guy who needed a second chance. I'm a guy who needed a new life. And whether I liked it or not, it was sink or swim. And that's true of everybody who's in, not only in our white-collar support group or in the criminal justice, but that's true of a lot of people in life in a lot of different ways. Life presents us with a lot of challenges where our lives are, immeasurably and irreparably changed. And what are we going to do? And so, the theology of having a new life and a resurrected life was fundamental to my ability to move forward and then to be a servant leader. But I didn't know that then. I just knew that I needed to breathe. I needed to choose to live, and I found a path to do that. And so when we look at passages like Matthew 25, for example, which is an easy one to preach from, it all corresponds to this new life that I've been able to build for myself, my family, and my community, and then to receive, because I would say without any false humility whatsoever, I learn more and I receive more from the people that I'm with every day than I could possibly give to them. And that's the magic and the mystery of it all.
Please join me in thanking Jeff Grant.
Thank you.
Next week, we'll be marking Crossroads Community Services Sunday, and Interim Executive Director of Crossroads, Patrick Berquist, will be here to talk about the food insecurity crisis in our city. We hope we'll see you next week, and we hope we'll also see you for worship in just a few minutes at 11 a.m., whether in person or online. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Peter.